A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, Herman, I was checking the weather report this morning, and apparently there is a cold, dry wind blowing out of Paris that is making quite a few people in San Francisco and Beijing very nervous. It is a specific kind of wind, one that clears the clouds and brings a very sharp, very chilling clarity to the landscape.
The Mistral. It really is such a fitting name for what Arthur Mensch and his team have built over there. For those who do not know their French geography, the Mistral is this powerful seasonal wind that sweeps through the Rhone Valley. It is famous for being incredibly strong and for making the air so clear you can see for miles. Today's prompt from Daniel is about Mistral AI's evolution into Europe's primary AI champion, and honestly, the timing is perfect given that they just dropped Voxtral yesterday on March 26th.
I saw that. Voxtral. It sounds like a character from a 90s space opera, or maybe a brand of throat lozenges, but I assume it is actually something much more technical. I am Korn, by the way, the guy who asks the questions that usually involve why we are spending billions of dollars on digital brains when we still have not figured out how to make a printer work consistently.
And I am Herman Poppleberry, the one who stays up until 3 in the morning reading the technical reports and white papers so you do not have to. And you are right about the name, Korn, but Voxtral is actually a massive deal for the edge computing space. It is their first open-weight voice model, and it is specifically designed to run on things like your phone or your watch rather than a massive server farm in the desert.
We will get to the talking robots in a minute. I want to look at the big picture first. Mistral is not just some scrappy startup anymore. They have hit a $14 billion valuation. They are backed by ASML, and they seem to be the only thing standing between Europe and total AI irrelevance. Is this actually a viable geopolitical hedge, or is it just French pride with a very expensive API?
It is becoming a very real hedge. If you look at the Series C funding round from last September, the fact that ASML led that with a €1.7 billion investment is the signal. ASML basically controls the world supply of the lithography machines needed to make high-end chips. For them to own 11% of Mistral suggests they are trying to build a vertically integrated European tech stack. They want the silicon and the software to live on the same continent, and they want them to be optimized for each other.
That makes sense from a sovereignty perspective. If the US or China decides to pull the plug on API access, Europe needs its own engine. But the market does not care about sovereignty if the models are slow or stupid. Mistral's whole brand has been built on this idea of efficiency, specifically the mixture of experts architecture. For the people who are not currently wearing a pocket protector, can you explain why that actually matters for a business? Because mixture of experts sounds like a very expensive law firm.
The mixture of experts approach, or MOE, is essentially about not using the whole brain for every single word the model writes. Think about Mistral Large 3. It has a total of 675 billion parameters, which sounds massive and slow. But when it actually processes a query, it only activates about 41 billion of those parameters. It uses a router to decide which experts within the model are best suited for the specific task at hand.
So it is like having a massive library, but only sending the 3 librarians who actually know about the specific topic you are asking about, instead of making the entire staff run to the shelf.
Because only a fraction of the model is active at any given time, the compute cost drops significantly, and the latency, the time it takes for the model to start talking back to you, is much lower than a dense model of the same total size. This is why Mistral Small 4, which they just released on March 18th, is such a powerhouse. It is a 119 billion parameter model, but it only uses 6 billion active parameters per token.
6 billion? That is tiny compared to something like GPT 5.4 Mini or the bigger Claude models. Does it actually hold its own? Or are we sacrificing too much intelligence for the sake of speed? I mean, a fast intern who gives me the wrong answer is still just a person giving me the wrong answer.
On general benchmarks, it is incredibly competitive. Mistral Small 4 actually consolidates their specialized models. It takes the reasoning from Magistral, the multimodal capabilities from Pixtral, and the coding skills from Devstral and puts them into one hybrid architecture. They are claiming a 40% reduction in completion time compared to Small 3. For a developer building an agentic workflow where the model has to think and act in real time, that speed is the difference between a tool that feels like magic and one that feels like a chore.
I like the idea of speed, but I have to play the skeptic here. When I look at the high-end reasoning tasks, like the software engineering benchmarks, where these models have to actually fix bugs in real code, the SWE bench, Mistral still seems to trail behind the top-tier American models, like Claude 4.5. Are they just destined to be the budget-friendly, fast option, or can they actually compete on raw intelligence?
That is the big question for 2026. Arthur Minch has been very vocal about the fact that they are not trying to build a godlike artificial general intelligence in a basement. They are building industrial tools. They might trail slightly on the absolute edge of reasoning, but for 95% of enterprise use cases, you do not need a model that can write poetry and solve unsolved physics problems. You need a model that can summarize a legal brief or write a Python script without hallucinating. They are aiming for the useful middle of the market.
Speaking of industrial tools, let us talk about Mistral Forge. They launched this at the Nvidia conference last week, around March 17th. It feels like a pivot away from being a chatbot company and toward being an infrastructure company. It is less, talk to our bot, and more, build your own engine.
It is a total pivot. Mistral Forge is essentially a build-your-own platform. It allows enterprises to take Mistral's base models and train them on their own private data within their own secure environment. This is the direct answer to the data sovereignty fears that have been holding back European banks and healthcare providers. They do not want to send their customer data to a US-based API, even if there are privacy agreements in place. They want to own the weights, own the infrastructure, and run it on their own iron.
It is the I would rather do it myself strategy, which, knowing European regulations like the AI Act, is probably the only way they are allowed to do it without a mountain of paperwork. But does this put them in direct competition with the big cloud providers, or are they playing nice with the giants?
They are doing both, which is the clever part. They have a $16 million partnership with Microsoft, but the ASML and Nvidia ties suggest they want to be platform agnostic. If you are a giant French bank, you use Mistral Forge to build a custom version of Mistral Large 3 that knows everything about your internal compliance rules. You run that on premise. You are not a customer of OpenAI at that point. You are an owner of your own AI capability. You are buying the engine, not renting the car.
That sounds expensive to build, though. Mensch is projecting over €1 billion in revenue by the end of this year. That is a massive jump from the 300 million they were doing at the end of last year. Where is that money coming from? Is it all these bespoke enterprise deals, or are they selling something else?
A huge chunk of it is those enterprise deals. But there is also the efficiency angle. Because their models are so much cheaper to run, their margins are potentially much higher than a company like OpenAI, which is burning billions of dollars on massive, dense training runs. Mistral is proving that you can get 80% of the performance for 10% of the compute cost. In a world where GPU time is still the most valuable currency, that is a winning business model. They are the lean, mean French machine.
Let us look at the competition for a second. We have talked about the US giants, but what about the East? We did a whole episode on the cursor incident. Episode 1471, where it turned out a lot of people were secretly using Chinese models because they were just better at coding. How does Mistral stack up against Alibaba's Qwen 3.5 or DeepSeek v3.2? Because those models are incredibly cheap and incredibly smart.
That is where the pressure is really coming from. If you look at the performance to price ratios, DeepSeek and Qwen are often beating everyone, including Mistral. DeepSeek in particular has been aggressive with their pricing war, almost daring the Western companies to match them. Mistral's advantage in that fight is not necessarily just the price, but the trust factor. For a Western enterprise, a French model backed by ASML and Nvidia is a much easier sell than a model coming out of a Chinese lab, regardless of what the benchmarks say. It is about security and geopolitical alignment.
So it is the safe choice for people who want to stay in the Western sphere but do not want to be beholden to Silicon Valley. It is the third way.
Precisely. And that leads us to the open source debate. Daniel's prompt mentioned their specific approach to balancing open and commercial models. They call it a dual track strategy, but it is a bit more complicated than just some are free and some are not. There is a lot of confusion in the community about what open actually means here.
Right. Because they are not actually open source in the way a lot of people think, where you get the code and the data and the recipe. They use the Apache 2.0 license for the small stuff, but the big flagship models are open weight. Explain the distinction there, because I think a lot of people get tripped up on that.
It is a vital distinction. For a model like Mistral Small 4, it is Apache 2.0. You can take it, modify it, use it for whatever you want, and you do not owe them a dime. But for Mistral Large 3, they release the weights so you can see how it works and run it yourself on your own hardware. But if you are a high-revenue enterprise using it for commercial purposes, you have to pay for a license. It is a look but pay if you are rich model. It gives you the transparency and the control of open source, but with a commercial gate for the big players.
It is the try before you buy for the billionaire class. It seems to work, though. It builds a massive community of developers who love the models because they can tinker with the small ones on their laptops. And then when those developers go to their jobs at big corporations, they recommend the flagship version because they already know the ecosystem. It is a classic bottom-up adoption strategy.
It is, and it is working particularly well with the newer releases. Let us talk about Voxtral for a second, because that was the big news from yesterday. It is a 4 billion parameter voice model. It is designed to run on the edge, meaning on your phone or a wearable device, not in a data center. This is a huge shift away from the everything in the cloud mentality.
70 to 90 milliseconds of latency. That is incredibly fast. I mean, the human brain's reaction time in a conversation is usually around 200 milliseconds. So this thing is effectively responding faster than a human can process the silence. It is almost precognitive.
It is. And it supports 9 languages out of the box. This is where Mistral is leaning into the multi-surface future we talked about in episode 1500. They are not just building a box you type into on a website. They are building the voice for your smart glasses, your car, and your phone. Because it is an open weight model, developers can integrate it directly into their hardware without needing a constant internet connection to a server in Virginia. It works in a tunnel, it works on a plane, it works in a basement.
I can see the appeal. No more. I am sorry, I am having trouble connecting to the internet when I am just trying to ask my watch to set a timer while I am cooking. But 4 billion parameters for a voice model, is that enough to sound human? Or are we back to the robotic monotone of the early 2000s, where every robot sounded like it was reading a grocery list?
It is surprisingly expressive. They have used some very clever training techniques to capture prosody and emotion. It does not sound like a tinny robot, it sounds like a person. And because it is edge native, it is private. Your voice data never leaves the device. For a company like Mistral, this is a huge differentiator. They are saying, we will give you the intelligence in the voice and we will let you keep the privacy. That is a very strong pitch in Europe.
It is a compelling pitch, but I have to wonder about the long-term sustainability. They are valued at $14 billion. They are projecting $1 billion in revenue. That is a 14 times multiple, which is actually pretty reasonable for a high-growth tech company in 2026. But they are competing against companies like Google and Meta with literally hundreds of billions of dollars in cash reserves. Can Mistral keep up with the scaling laws? If GPT-6 requires a $100 billion cluster, does Mistral just get left in the dust?
That is the existential threat. But Mensch's gamble is that the scaling laws for usefulness are different from the scaling laws for raw intelligence. You might need a $100 billion cluster to create a model that can pass the bar exam and discover new materials, but you might only need a few $100 million to create the best coding assistant or the most efficient customer service agent. Mistral is betting on the good enough and very fast market. They are building the Volkswagens and Fords of AI, while OpenAI is trying to build a starship.
Which is where most of the money is, honestly. Most businesses do not need a digital Einstein. They need a very competent digital intern who never sleeps and costs 5 cents an hour. If I am running a logistics company, I do not need my AI to write sonnets. I need it to optimize truck routes.
And that brings us back to the ASML connection. ASML is not just an investor, they are a strategic partner. There is a lot of speculation that Mistral is getting early access to specialized hardware or even helping influence the design of future AI-specific chips. If Europe can build a closed loop where the chips are designed for the models and the models are designed for the chips, they could potentially bypass the raw brute force scale of the US giants. It is about efficiency through integration.
It is the Apple approach, but on a continental scale. Use the vertical integration to squeeze out performance that other people can only get by throwing more electricity at the problem. I noticed you have not mentioned the French government yet. They have been pretty vocal about supporting Mistral. Is that a help or a hindrance? Because sometimes government support is just another word for bureaucracy.
It is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the French government has been a massive advocate for Mistral in Brussels, fighting against some of the more restrictive parts of the AI Act that would have hampered local innovation. They want a French champion. On the other hand, being seen as a national champion can sometimes make it harder to win over customers in other countries like Germany or the UK who might be wary of French industrial policy. But so far, Mensch has navigated it well. He has kept the company's image very professional and technically focused. He is a researcher first, a CEO second.
He does seem to have that no-nonsense vibe. I saw an interview where he basically dismissed the whole AGI doom and gloom narrative as a marketing distraction. He just wants to build better software. He seems almost annoyed by the hype.
He is very grounded. He comes from DeepMind and Meta, so he has seen the hype cycles from the inside. His focus is on what he calls sovereign AI. It is about giving European institutions the tools to participate in the AI revolution without having to sign away their digital autonomy. It is a very pragmatic, very European view of the world.
So, for the developers listening, what is the actual takeaway here? If they are starting a new project today, why should they look at Mistral Small 4 instead of just plugging into the Claude or OpenAI ecosystems? What is the killer feature for the person actually writing the code?
The takeaway is control and cost. If you use Mistral Small 4, especially through something like Mistral Forge, you are building on a foundation that you can eventually move onto your own infrastructure if you need to. You are not locked into a single provider's proprietary ecosystem, and from a technical standpoint, the latency on Small 4 is just hard to beat. If you are building an application that requires multiple model calls in a sequence, like a complex agentic workflow where the model has to plan, search, and then act, those milliseconds add up. You save seconds of wait time for your users. That is the difference between an app that feels snappy and one that feels broken.
And for the enterprise folks, the C-suite types, who are listening while they wait for their morning croissant, what is the message for them?
For them, it is about data sovereignty and risk management. The shift from using an API to owning the infrastructure is the big trend of 2026. Mistral Forge is the most mature path to that right now. It allows you to say to your board of directors, yes, we are using world-class AI, and no, our proprietary data is not being used to train a competitor's model in California. That is a very powerful statement in a regulated industry like finance or healthcare. It turns AI from a liability into an asset.
But we have to give them the reality check too. If you are trying to build the next breakthrough in scientific research, or you need a model that can reason through an incredibly complex, multi-step engineering problem that has never been seen before, Mistral Large 3 might still let you down compared to the absolute state-of-the-art from Anthropic or OpenAI. We should not pretend they are the leaders in every category.
That is fair. They are not the leaders in high-end reasoning. If you look at the SWE bench results, which measure the ability to resolve real GitHub issues, Mistral is respectable but not at the top of the leaderboard. They are the workhorses, not the geniuses. But in the real world, we need a lot more workhorses than we need geniuses. Most of the world's work is not solving new physics, it is moving data from point A to point B and making sure it is correct.
That is a very Herman thing to say. I think there is a lot of wisdom in it, though. The world is built on the backs of the workhorses. So, looking ahead, what is the one thing you are watching for, Mistral, in the next 6 months? What is the signal in the noise?
I am watching the ASML partnership. If we see a move where Mistral starts offering specialized hardware-software bundles where you can buy a server preloaded and optimized for Mistral Forge, that is a game changer. It would essentially be the mainframe of the AI era, a literal AI in a box that you just plug into your data center and it works. No cloud required, no external dependencies. That would be the ultimate fulfillment of the sovereignty promise.
The return of the black box. Everything old is new again. I actually find that idea strangely comforting. It is much more tangible than a nebulous cloud, API that could change its terms of service tomorrow. I like things I can kick.
It is. It makes I feel like a utility, like electricity or water, rather than some mysterious oracle that lives on a server you cannot see. It democratizes the power of the model by making it a physical asset you can own.
Well, I, for one, am glad the French are keeping us on our toes. It makes for a much more interesting landscape than the simple US-China duopoly. And if it means my watch can actually understand me when I'm in a tunnel, I'm all for it. Even if it does have a slightly French accent in its logic.
The multi-surface future is coming, Korn, whether we are ready for it or not. And Mistral is making sure Europe has a seat at the table.
As long as the sloth-to-human translation models are accurate, I think I will be fine. We should probably wrap this up before you start explaining the math behind the Voxtral prosody layers, and we lose half the audience to an app.
I was just getting to the good part about the neural vocoders, but you are right, we should keep it tight.
For the people who want to dive deeper, you can find the technical breakdowns of Mistral Small 4 and the Forge platform on their website. And if you have not heard our episode on the cursor incident, check out episode 1471. It gives a lot of context on why these efficient models are suddenly winning the hearts and minds of developers over the massive dense models.
Also, episode 1500 on the Beyond the Chatbot shift is a great companion piece for understanding why Voxtral and edge computing matter so much right now. It is all about the move from the screen to the world.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly and making sure our own audio does not have too much latency. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our own little piece of the AI revolution.
We could not do it without them.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really does help us reach new listeners who might be looking for a bit more depth in their tech news. It is the only way the algorithm knows we exist.
You can also find us at myweirdprops.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We have got transcripts and technical notes for every episode.
Or search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. We are everywhere.
See you in the next one.
Stay curious, everyone. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.